All right. So in the last topic we covered was how we access data on the web. In this one, how we take the data that we received from the web and use it in our application. And we're going to use a protocol or a data format known as JSON. All right. And this is the most common data format that web or application uses nowadays to exchange information. Before, we used to use XML, but XML is an old technology. It was a lot of overhead, a lot of headaches, and it only supports strings, but JSON is a lot more flexible. So what are we talking about? JSON stands for Java Script Object Notation. I will go over these examples quickly, but everything is an object. It starts with a curly bracket and ends with a curly bracket. It has the basic format of it, an attribute and a value. An attribute and a value. These values can have different values, different types. Could be a string, could be an array, could be an integer, could be a double, could be a Boolean, could be nil. So you have a lot more flexibility than what? Than XML. All right. It's an open standard format, uses a human readable text. So if I read this, I understand what the data means. Each object consists of attribute and value pair. It's mainly used primarily to transfer information between applications and servers, and it is language independent format. It doesn't matter what language you use, Java, Swift, C#, Python, all these languages, it's independent of the language that you use. Again, objects starts with, whenever you see curly brackets, and opening curly bracket and a closing curly bracket, it's a beginning and ending of an object. So in this example, we have a beginning and ending of an object. Inside of it, you could have multiple objects, and we're going to dig through these in a minute. So we have a beginning and ending of an object, a beginning and an ending of an object. So that is the basic format of JSON data. It's object-based, and each object starts with an opening bracket and closing brackets. In this case, in this example we looked at, we have an array. JSON supports arrays. So we have you see the square bracket here and a square bracket here. So this attribute, which is called favorite movies, is an array, and it contains multiple objects. We have an object here, comma, another object here. You see that? So here are the attributes and their values. All right, here's an attribute and a value, an attribute and a value, an attribute and a value. Okay. Here are string values that we looked at before. Here are integer values. As I said before, JSON support different data types, unlike XML. So these belong, if you go back, all these attributes belong to the outer object. These attributes belong to the favorite movie, right? Array, and each one of those is an object by itself. Now, how do we decode data, JSON data? In the previous video, in the protocol example, I showed you how we encode object to JSON data. But how we do the reverse, how we take JSON data and encode it into objects or decode it into objects. So what do? We say here, same thing, this request comes from the internet. We have a URL session. We're getting data from the internet, like in the previous lecture. And then here, I check the data. If the data is okay, I'm creating a JSON decoder. This is that decoder. And then I say, try to decode a string. It's basically a dictionary here. It's a dictionary with key value pairs that self from the data that we've created. This is if you don't have a structure. So this will just give you the JSON data, but that's not how we typically use this. We usually define our structures instead of this dictionary, and then it will map the data that we receive from the internet into that structure. So here is how we do that. And this is what we did last time in the example, the demo that we did. So assume that we got this data from JSON data. The report date is a string. The product file ID is a string. The name is a string. And the read count is 5. So this is the object that we received from JSON, from the web. How do I create a model or a structure in our application that represent this JSON data and encode this data or decode this data into that structure? First, you need to create the structure. So here's my structure, and here are my attributes. These names typically matches those names. So report date, profile ID, name, and count. Now, if they don't match it, you need to do something extra. If you decided to have your different names than what you receive here, for example, here they are using these conventions, report underscore date, profile underscore ID, but in the structure, I'm using name, creation date, profile ID, read count. If you decide to change, to use different names than the one that is sent in the JSON file, then you have to do an extra step. You need to define what we call enumeration. It's called coding key. And now you can have the flexibility to have your own names instead of what is being sent to you from the server. If you want to stick to the information from the server, you don't need this extra step. So what do? This is an enum with a string called coding keys, the key value pairs, basically. So you have string and the coding key. The string that you receive from the internet in the JSON object, and the key that you want to, the field name that you want to use, right? So for example, name, if you look at the previous one, in the previous name is name. So I'm okay with that field. I'm not going to change it. But the rest of them I'm going to change. So creation date is the report date that I receive from the JSON data. So anytime you see report data or report date, it will be mapped to this field in this structure. So the report attributes or in the JSON object will be, the value of that will be placed in this field name called creation date. So in my structure, I will use those values, those field names, instead of the ones that are being sent to me. Same thing with the profile ID, same thing with the read count. So it'll give you flexibility to use different names from the stuff that is being sent to us from the internet and have your own field names, all right? And this is how you do it. Same thing, you create the decoder. Now, instead of that array, I use the name of the structure. So if you look at this one, this is the name of the structure, report. And then here I will have report.self, and then from the data that we receive from the internet. That's it for the decoding the data. All right. We are done for today, and I will see you. We're going to cover the concurrency next time, and we'll do more examples.